Do you remember those cheap dinners every working-class family ate in the 1980s? The ones that got us through more than just hunger? These meals showed up night after night, made from whatever was on hand, stretched with care and quiet determination. What did they leave behind that we still carry with us? Eggplant Parmesan was the dinner that looked like it took all day but was secretly built on shortcuts. Frozen breaded eggplant rounds if you could find them, jarred marinara sauce, a bag of shredded mozzarella, and maybe some Parmesan if it wasn't too expensive that week. You layered it all like lasagna: sauce, eggplant, cheese, repeat. Baked it till the edges bubbled and the kitchen smelled like you knew what you were doing. It was meatless, but no one complained. It was heavy enough to count. Kids picked around the eggplant for cheese. Dads ate it with white bread and butter on the side. It was a Friday night special when money was tight, or a Sunday dinner for Catholics avoiding meat. The eggplant always went soggy after reheating, but no one minded. It filled the belly and stretched a few ingredients into a tray big enough to feed 6. Some called it Italian, but it was more like American survival with a red sauce. It looked impressive, tasted decent, and made you feel like you'd pulled off something grand. Even if it came from the freezer aisle and took 20 minutes to throw together, that golden cheese crust gave it the shine of love. Mock-fried chicken steak is a really interesting one because this actually makes use of so many things in creative ways to mimic the texture, taste, and overall feeling of fried chicken steak. Traditionally, the recipe calls for cheap cuts of meat, but in the Great Depression, people were even running with non-meat ingredients thanks to World War II rationing, which really put a massive hole in America's overall meat supply. In the 50s, too, home cooks brought this recipe back when they really needed to stretch a small amount of protein or use government food. So if you make this dish with ground meat or beef pork and shape it into a patty, mix it with breadcrumbs and cracker crumbs, and then douse it in seasoned flour or cracker crumbs again, then pan fry it, you get a pretty decent imitation of chicken fried steak. You just have to be really careful with what kind of seasonings you use, because it's also true that the kind of seasoning you go with decides how good of an imitation of a chicken fried steak this is. The most interesting part is probably the flour-based version, which was straight out of the Depression. People would make a fritter using flour, milk, and eggs to make something that resembled a steak, and this was seasoned and fried. There was no meat, but it was meant to imitate the breading, flour-y taste of the meal anyway. In all cases, it was a comfort meat, and a chunk of that comfort was that it kept your wallet in good health. Stuffed shells were dinner that looked like love. Not the quick kind, but the kind that took time. Boiling pasta, mixing ricotta with egg and herbs, ladling sauce, sprinkling cheese, and sliding it all into the oven. It was the kind of meal you made when the paycheck landed, the weekend started, or you wanted everyone to sit down at the table together. There was always enough to feed a neighbor or save for lunch the next day. It was filling, rich, and made a kitchen smell like a promise. The shells held the ricotta like little pockets of warmth, and the red sauce bubbled around them like a hug. No shortcuts, no mystery powders or packets. Just pasta, cheese, sauce, and the kind of effort that said, "You matter." Dads appreciated the leftovers. Kids fought over the browned edges. Moms quietly savored the first bite before anyone else sat down. It was a dish for gathering, sharing, and holding on to something solid in a fast, loud world. In medieval Europe, fish and root vegetables were the most common thing for a majority of the population. Most of them could not afford to sustainably get meat every single time they went out for grocery shopping. It was also something that was really preferred by religious followers of the church, although I can't really imagine a specific reason why. For root vegetables, I can see veganism being something a well-intending church appreciates, but then why the meat? If there are any history buffs in the comments, let us know. Now, the dish itself would change a lot. This would heavily depend on the kind of climate and geography you were working with. Coastal regions, like along the North Sea or the Baltic, for example, had a dense ecosystem of marine life. They had herring, whiting, haddock and cod, salmon or crabs, and people would often just work with whatever the catch of the day was. These fish would be salted and dried as much as they could, both for inland trade and for winter preservation. Root vegetables were also dearly important to people because they were one of the few kinds of vegetables that could withstand poor soils and still last through the winter. One of these vegetables was the iconic carrot. And here's an interesting fact. In medieval times, you actually had purple and yellow carrots instead of orange. Bread pudding with water sauce is about as simplistic as it comes. This is a dish that people didn't even really put any thought into. It was just a way for them to repurpose resources that were about to spoil and go to waste. This is really something you never want happening in the Depression because it was a sign that you were just not handling your pantry properly. Back then, people religiously followed a mindset of not wasting anything, even the grease and drippings from bacon, and you'll find a dish or two made out of that later on in this video too. Back to bread pudding with water sauce. So, you might have heard of bread pudding before, but what really is water sauce? I mean, it sounds like a bastardized version of sparkling water when you first hear it. It's actually just a modest attempt at making a thickened sauce out of just water, because most of the time people were not working with any kind of legitimate thickener or enough ingredients to make a proper sauce, so they had to settle for whatever they could come up with to make stale bread more refreshing. The bread pudding in question is essentially just stale, almost moldy bread soaked in sweetened water, and most of the time, the sweetening was with things like maple syrup. Even this is something people began to tap out of maple trees whenever they could because they couldn't spend the extra cents. Still, we have a lot more leverage nowadays, so you can probably actually make a decent bread pudding-based sauce dish with enough ingredients and guidance, but the next time you really need to finish some bread, you know what to make. Once a humble staple of farmhouse kitchens, savory sweet onion pie was a testament to how simple ingredients could be transformed into something extraordinary. With its flaky crust, velvety custard, and layers of slow caramelized onions, this pie was both comforting and surprisingly elegant, a dish that fit just as well on a holiday table as it did at a casual family dinner. Onions have long been one of the most affordable and widely available vegetables, making them a practical choice for home cooks looking to stretch their budget. When cooked low and slow, their sharp bite mellowed into a deep, natural sweetness. Combined with eggs, cream, and sometimes a sprinkle of cheese, they created a rich, quiche-like filling that was both satisfying and economical. Some versions leaned into the southern tradition of sweet onions, using Vidalias to enhance the dish's natural sugars. So, why did this once popular pie disappear? As savory tarts and quiches became more associated with upscale brunches rather than home-cooked meals, hearty onion-based dishes faded from everyday menus. The rise of pre-made frozen quiches also contributed, making from-scratch versions less common. In the mid-20th century, the agricultural industry was on a mission to maximize production, and antibiotics played a key role in that effort. One in particular, chloramphenicol, became a popular choice for keeping livestock healthy and increasing meat yields. Farmers saw it as an efficient way to prevent infections in crowded conditions, while food producers benefited from higher output. For a time, it seemed like a win-win, until scientists uncovered the serious health risks lurking beneath the surface. Unlike some antibiotics that merely disrupt digestion, chloramphenicol posed a far more alarming danger: aplastic anemia, a rare but potentially fatal condition where the body stops producing enough blood cells. The problem wasn't just with direct exposure. Traces of the antibiotic could linger in meat and dairy products, making their way onto dinner tables across the country. Consumers had no way of knowing that their Sunday roast might come with a side of medical complications. As evidence mounted, regulators took action. By the 1980s, chloramphenicol was banned in food production in many countries, including the United States. Today, strict testing ensures that no remnants make it into the food supply. Fried Bologna sandwiches were the poor man's ribeye. You sliced the Bologna thick, tossed it in a skillet, and watched it sizzle until the edges curled like petals. Slapped between two pieces of white bread, maybe with a slice of cheese or a squirt of mustard, it was hot, greasy joy. It smelled like lunch trucks and childhood. This was not health food, it was real food. The kind made after overtime shifts or between bus rides when money was short and stomachs were loud. Bologna was cheap, but fried. It became something else entirely, something smoky, savory, and deeply American. It hit the table fast and disappeared even faster. Moms made it for lunch, dads made it after work, kids made it after school. It was dinner for people who worked with their hands and lived paycheck to paycheck, but still deserved something hot and good. Salted fish and porridge is an example of an essential combination in medieval times. It was especially popular in coastal and northern regions. This is because preservation was a massive deal in those areas due to how they were always just dealing with rougher, colder climates. Also, it might be surprising, but fish was a religious pillar for people. The Catholic Church back then was the reigning religious authority, and it would impose all kinds of fast days, especially every Friday. See, here, any kind of meat was forbidden, except fish. The logic behind this is that the practice of fasting during Lent and on Fridays is to abstain from fleshly meat, but since fish are cold-blooded, they don't come into flesh meat. It's a technical exception. The porridge itself was something that would contrast very well with the fermented taste of the fish, and in some households, people were adding herbs, onions, and garlic as well. This was a dish that was always eaten out of necessity. Boiled salt pork and beans are pretty much the same deal. Now, beans just happen to be man's best friend when the going gets rough. You have so many different kinds of them, and you can have twice as many different kinds of food with them. Stews, soups, or something as economical as this. Boiled salt pork and beans actually stems from the Depression era, and it was a way to stretch out meat rations when they were running low, which was usually always. This is more beans than pork, I'll admit, but either way, it's a protein power punch that you don't want to be missing from your diet. Boiled salt pork and beans are also some of the easiest kinds of plates of food you can make. You don't really need to do anything besides just take the salt pork and boil it, along with the beans, adding whatever seasonings, aromatics, and herbs you prefer. That's pretty much how a lot of people used it back then anyway, although we have the benefit of choosing much better cuts of meat than they did. Even with a dish like this, in the Depression era, people would essentially just wait until the butcher's shops were discarding their most unwanted parts of the animal, and that's what they would buy for as cheap of a price as they could bargain for. It was usually something most shops were happy to let go of for some chump change, but nowadays, even that's like half your rent. There was a time when vegetables weren't just steamed and forgotten on the side of the plate, they were the star of the meal. This dish took humble cauliflower and elevated it to something rich, comforting, and undeniably satisfying. Baked in a velvety cheese sauce and topped with golden breadcrumbs, creamy cauliflower gratin was a favorite at homecoming dinners, potlucks, and holiday tables alike. Cauliflower was once an affordable and widely available vegetable, appreciated for its versatility. It absorbed flavors beautifully, making it a natural pairing for creamy, cheesy sauces. The gratin method, borrowed from classic French cooking, ensured that every bite was infused with deep, savory richness. The top layer of breadcrumbs added just the right amount of crunch, creating a contrast that kept each forkful interesting. Some home cooks added a pinch of nutmeg or mustard to enhance the flavor, while others used a mix of cheeses for extra depth. So why did it fade from dinner tables? As frozen and canned vegetables became more common, fresh cauliflower lost its appeal. Many home cooks swapped slow-baked dishes for quicker, less labor-intensive sides, and gratins became associated with special occasions rather than everyday meals. In an era defined by boundless optimism and experimental remedies, a curious tonic emerged: radioactive or radioactive water. During a time when scientific breakthroughs were celebrated without the benefit of modern safety protocols, this radium-infused elixir was marketed as a miracle drink, promising renewed vitality. Companies boldly touted its rejuvenating properties while food safety oversight was in its infancy, and regulations lagged behind the fervor for innovation. Although endorsements by well-known figures lent it credibility, users eventually discovered that regular consumption led to severe health risks, including bone decay and radiation poisoning, a grim reminder that not every scientific experiment was a step forward. Intriguingly, advertisements depicted radioactive as a fountain of youth in a bottle, a claim that today would undoubtedly trigger public outcry rather than applause. Its popularity stemmed from the era's trust in emerging technologies and a willingness to embrace unconventional treatments during uncertain times. The tale of Radithor serves as a compelling chapter in our culinary and pharmaceutical history, highlighting a period when progress sometimes outpaced prudence. Boiled bread dumplings were sometimes known as sinkers, mostly because they would just sit there as if they were sinking into the plate, but these were really as frugal as it would get. This was a dish that was made from old or stale bread, and all it took was fat, some eggs, or just an egg really, and bread, flour, and water. These dumplings were something you would see a lot in immigrant neighborhoods, especially the ones that were always around factories, industrial sites, construction sites, just heavy-duty neighborhoods where most laborers would live to cut down on commute. They started off as a way of just using stale bread so that it wouldn't go to waste. But the question is, how do you actually make dumplings at home like that? Well, the bread was just soaked in hot water, and the flour was mixed in so that it would hold. If an egg wasn't there, it would be a bit looser of a dish, but the dough would still be thickened, and the mixture would just need to be formed into rough balls. The dumplings were then simmered and boiled, and there you had it. Each immigrant community had its own different variation of this too. German, Eastern European, and Czech communities all had their own definition of what making this should be like. Chili cheese dogs weren't just dinner, they were an event. You boiled or grilled the hot dogs, lined them up on soft buns, then drowned them in canned chili. Not the fancy kind, just meat and beans and grease. Then came the shredded cheddar piled so high it melted into the cracks. Maybe you sprinkled chopped onions on top if you were brave. You served them on paper plates because the mess was biblical. Kids loved them. Dads swore by them. Friday nights in front of the game or Saturdays with friends in the garage, this was the food that brought people together. It wasn't healthy, it wasn't pretty, but it was loud, messy, and completely satisfying. You didn't eat just one. You ate 2 or 3 and felt it for the rest of the night. But no one cared. Because for those 10 greasy, cheesy minutes, you weren't worried about bills or work or anything else. You were just eating something that tasted good, with people you liked, with napkins stacked high and bellies filling fast. It was dinner you remembered, not because it was fancy, but because it was real. Rye pancakes are a fantastic option to go for if you have a family of 4 and live in prehistoric times. They were one of the most common recipes, despite what you might be thinking. These people were still walking around wearing chainmail armor and robes, so how'd they end up having pancakes? Well, they're actually pretty different from the kinds of pancakes we're used to today. These are just rye flour, water, some salt, and that's it. It makes a batter that can be ladled, but most people would typically just pour it onto a griddle or a hot stone suspended over a hearth. This was the most common way to cook desserts or breakfast in these times. If you were lucky enough to have milk or buttermilk, you could replace the water with that, and it would usually make them a bit more tender. People typically fried these in butter or animal fat. Well, if it wasn't a fasting day. Rye usually does not need to be flavored much, but what flavorings people did use, they were very different from what we have today. People used stewed vegetables, onions and garlic instead of Miracle Whip, rainbow sprinkles and maple syrup. Egg and tomato gravy over rice is still something that you can consider a proper meal though. So, the thing about the 20th century is that people back then had a way stronger knack for gardening and farming than we ever did or maybe will. It actually helped an intense amount during times like the Depression because it would mean you could do super simple things like this. Who needs meat, breadcrumbs, oil, and cheese when you can just boil some rice, scramble some eggs, beat some tomatoes to hell and back, get a sick paste, and have a meal? It's easy work. It doesn't take anything, and it's convenient and nearly free if you're growing your own stuff. Today, it would make for a pretty decent meal in between your dinner and breakfast, too. If you're looking for something that's refreshing, full of energy, protein, and still on the healthy side of things, then this is definitely a dish you should keep in mind. It's something that we got from the South, but it's also something you would see in cities sometimes. The idea of making gravy out of it also helped people a lot in broadening their horizons to more curry gravy-based rice dishes, which are essential for surviving through times when food is a resource and not entertainment. In the 1960s, packaging was more about durability and design than long-term safety. And nowhere was that more evident than in lead-based paint on food containers. Vibrant labels, eye-catching colors, and a sturdy finish made these containers look appealing on store shelves. But hidden beneath the surface was a toxic hazard. Lead-based paint, commonly used in everything from household walls to children's toys, also found its way onto food packaging, a decision that, in hindsight, was as dangerous as it sounds. At the time, lead's risks weren't fully understood by the general public. While scientists had long suspected its dangers, regulations were slow to catch up. The problem was that lead doesn't just stay on the surface. Over time, it can leach into food, especially acidic products like canned tomatoes. Consumers had no way of knowing that their favorite pantry staples might come with a side of neurotoxicity. The health risks were severe. Chronic exposure to lead can cause developmental issues in children, memory problems in adults, and even organ failure in extreme cases. As research mounted, the government stepped in. By the late 1970s, lead-based paints were banned from food-related products. A perfectly roasted chicken was once the ultimate symbol of home cooking. Before rotisserie chickens lined supermarket shelves, families gathered around the table for a golden, crispy-skinned bird fresh from the oven. Coated in a flavorful crust of herbs and breadcrumbs, this dish turned an everyday staple into something worthy of a special occasion. Whole chickens were a budget-friendly choice, stretching across multiple meals. Unlike pre-cut pieces, a whole bird could be roasted, carved, and repurposed into soups or sandwiches, making it a practical investment. The breadcrumb and herb crust added texture and flavor, sealing in juices while creating a beautifully crisp exterior. Traditional blends featured rosemary, thyme, and parsley, but regional variations introduced garlic, lemon zest, or even a hint of paprika for extra depth. Pre-seasoned chicken breasts, boneless cuts, and store-bought rotisserie birds made the slow-roasted whole chicken tradition feel unnecessary. For many, the extra step of trussing, seasoning, and roasting no longer fit into busy weeknight schedules. Yet, for those who remember the aroma of herbs mingling with sizzling chicken fat in a warm oven, there's no substitute. Hamburger Helper Stroganoff was the shortcut to comfort, neatly tucked into a cardboard box on the pantry shelf. It was ground beef browned in a skillet, noodles that boiled soft in the same pan, and a creamy sauce packet that somehow made it all feel like more than the sum of its parts. This was not about gourmet. It was about getting something warm and filling on the table in under 20 minutes. For working families of the 1980s, that mattered more than anything. Kids grew up knowing the sound of the stove clicking on meant Hamburger Helper night. It meant mom or dad had just clocked out, peeled off steel-toed boots, and needed something easy that still felt like dinner. No one thought twice about additives or sodium back then. The creaminess was the point, and the boxed magic made even a lean paycheck stretch into something satisfying. A little parsley sprinkled on top made it look fancy. It was cheap, it was dependable, and it was loved. The sauce stuck to the noodles clung to the beef, and the whole dish clung to the memory of dinner time when life was simpler, harder, and strangely fuller than now. Lentil soups were even more common in the medieval world. They would change a lot depending on the region, though. For example, in Europe's southern regions like Provence and Spain, lentils were not only used to feed humans, but also to feed animals. Lentil pottages were one of the most important meals for the church as well, because when the fast would break, this was one of the few meals that could feed an entire group and still be very easy to prepare. Lentils would provide an incredible dose of protein, and it would need just water and a few other vegetables if you could spare them. Onions, leeks, and garlic, or just some savory or sage would work really well. In the Middle East and North Africa, lentil soups were something else entirely. Medieval Arab cookbooks like Anwa al-Saidala F. Alwan al-Atima would feature all kinds of lentil recipes with an incredible amount of flavoring, seasonings, and spices to make it stand out from other dishes. It would be a lot more bombastic and flavorful than European versions of the same dish, and if looking at today's world is any example, I think it's historically accurate to say that they've always had us beat when it comes to working with legumes. We've talked a lot about butcher shops and what kind of cuts of meat they would usually throw away. So one of those was the liver. and one of the best ways to use it was to make a liver loaf out of it. People would genuinely do this. It would help a lot, because livers were believed to not only be very dense in their protein content, but also really good for building blood and increasing your overall bone health. Livers were something that a lot of people back then were accustomed to eating as well, even though the metallic and iron-rich taste doesn't perform too well in today's climate. I mean, we have liver fans, but I'm just not sure how many of them would sustainably eat it every week. Either way, liver loaf was something that was more loaf and less liver, because even if the meat was one of the cheapest livers you could find, it still did need to be stretched out badly. It was good to have this with bread to make it more palatable, though. Some of the best dishes come from necessity, and few ingredients are as dependable as potatoes. For generations, scalloped potatoes were a staple at homecoming dinners, potlucks, and Sunday feasts. Thinly sliced and baked in a rich, velvety sauce, they were a testament to the idea that simple ingredients, when treated right, could feel downright luxurious. Potatoes were the backbone of many American kitchens. They were cheap, easy to store, and could feed an entire family without much effort. The addition of a creamy sauce, made from milk, butter, and a touch of garlic, elevated this humble dish into something special. Some versions kept it simple, while others included layers of cheese, turning it into a gooey, golden masterpiece. Either way, it was a comforting, belly-filling side that paired well with just about any main course. The cooking process required patience. Proper scalloped potatoes weren't rushed. Each layer had to absorb the sauce, and the top needed time to develop that perfect golden crust. But as boxed potato mixes and instant gratins took over, homemade scalloped potatoes started to fade from dinner tables. A household staple for decades, canned tuna was a go-to choice for quick meals and affordable protein. Packed with convenience and a mild flavor that fit everything from sandwiches to casseroles, its popularity surged throughout the 20th century. But hidden beneath its silver lid was an ingredient no one had bargained for: mercury. Some brands of tuna contained alarmingly high levels of the toxic metal, a risk that went largely unnoticed in the 1960s when food safety regulations had yet to catch up with modern science. Back then, concerns over contaminants weren't front-page news. The average consumer had little reason to suspect that a simple tuna salad might come with a side of neurological damage. Mercury, a heavy metal that can accumulate in the body, posed serious health risks, especially for pregnant women and young children. Symptoms of mercury poisoning included cognitive impairments, muscle weakness, and developmental issues, hardly what anyone expected from a lunchtime staple. As research progressed, regulatory agencies stepped in. By the 1970s, the FDA began imposing stricter limits on mercury levels in seafood, and today, guidelines recommend limiting the consumption of certain fish. Tater tot casserole was a symphony of simple. Ground beef browned in a pan, mixed with cream of mushroom soup, spread into a baking dish, and crowned with a perfect grid of frozen tater tots. It was like meatloaf and hash browns had a baby and raised it in the Midwest. The tots crisped in the oven while the filling turned into a savory, creamy mess. No one could resist the golden crunch followed by that hot, rich bite underneath. It was not just food, it was folklore. The kind of dish passed down from Aunt Susan to Cousin Mike with pride and a little grease stain on the recipe card. It was unfussy, easy to stretch, and beloved by the whole family. Dad called it stick-to-your-ribs food. Kids just wanted more ketchup. And Mom, exhausted from the day, knew this was one of the few dinners no one would complain about. It was not pretty, it was not healthy, but it was home. Rabbit stew is pretty self-explanatory. It's, well, rabbit stew, you know? I'm just kidding. It was a lot different from the stews we might be used to seeing today or even 50 to 60 years ago. Hunting wild game such as rabbits was how people lived off of the land, and making these stews would ensure enough food to last the day and give everyone 2 or 3 square meals. What people would do is add as many herbs, aromatics, and vegetables as they could. They took a very different approach to cooking. Some of these spices, like cumin or black pepper powder, may not necessarily have gone the best with rabbit stew. They were still added for any perceived medicinal benefits though, like digestion and gut health. Back then, people were so used to eating whatever was available or whatever would keep them full longer. If it would taste good, that would be even better, but something tasting good was never a priority. Hunting rabbits was something everyone, from kids to adults, would be involved in, and villages and communities would set out traps for miles to capture as much game as they could. One of the next inventive things people came up with during really hard times was potato peel soup. This is about as bare bones as it sounds because it's really just seasoned water that's been made into a makeshift broth with potato peels in there. Despite this, let me tell you a little about why this is a pretty good dish. It's because it keeps you full for an incredible amount of time. Have you ever had oatmeal and felt incredibly full afterward? For like a surprisingly long amount of time? This is because oatmeal has a substantial amount of fiber in it, and potatoes are pretty much the same. Half their fiber content comes from the peel itself, actually. This is what makes potato peel soup such a good dish for when you don't really have any kind of money. It sustains you and really helps keep your appetite down, which is sad in retrospect because you have to be keeping your hunger down, but these days we have to do that pretty often. It helps to have dishes that are really good with fiber because they have this nice effect of you wanting less food, and thus you have more money at the end of the day. Bright, tangy, and effortlessly elegant lemon chicken picata was once a dinner table favorite. With its delicate balance of citrus, butter, and briny capers, this dish turned simple ingredients into something refined. Italian-American families popularized it in mid-century kitchens, and by the 1960s, it had become a go-to recipe for home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to a weeknight meal. Chicken was an economical protein, but before boneless, skinless cuts were widely available, whole birds had to be broken down by hand. Picata was traditionally made with thinly pounded chicken breasts, quickly dredged in flour and sautéed until golden. The sauce was the star, fresh lemon juice and capers combined with a silky butter reduction to create a dish that was light yet deeply flavorful. It was often served with pasta or rice, making it both practical and satisfying. So why did this dish vanish from home kitchens? Over time, complex flavors gave way to simpler, more standardized meals. The rise of processed sauces and pre-made chicken dishes made from scratch picata seemed like more effort than it was worth. Few chemical names have caused as much unnecessary panic as dihydrogen monoxide. Despite sounding like something from a lab experiment gone wrong, this so-called hazardous substance was, in reality, nothing more than water. The term became the centerpiece of a long-running joke, highlighting how scientific jargon could manipulate public perception. In an era when food safety concerns were growing, misinformation had the power to create fear, even over something as essential as water. The 1960s saw increasing scrutiny over food additives, preservatives, and chemical compounds in everyday products. With rising concerns about artificial ingredients, people became more wary of what they consumed. The dihydrogen monoxide hoax played into that anxiety, proving how a lack of understanding could turn a necessity into a perceived threat. The irony? Every person alarmed by its presence had already been consuming it their entire lives. Though water itself is harmless in moderation, it's technically possible to overdose on it, a rare but real condition called water intoxication, where excessive consumption disrupts the body's sodium levels. Potato pancakes, crispy, golden, and sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, were where leftovers became a family ritual. You could use leftover mashed potatoes from last night's dinner or go old school with grated raw potatoes, onions, eggs, and a little flour. Either way, they were slapped onto a hot pan, fried till the edges were lacy and the inside stayed soft. They weren't fancy. They were peasant food, and proud of it. A little sour cream or applesauce on the side if you had it, ketchup if you didn't. You ate them with your fingers when no one was looking. Sometimes they came out heavy, like hockey pucks. Sometimes they were light and crispy like something from Grandma's better days. In Eastern European homes, they were tradition. In American kitchens, they were improvisation. You made them because you didn't waste food, and you didn't waste time either. They reheated well in a pan and even better in a kid's memory. You didn't call them latkes unless it was Hanukkah. Otherwise, they were just potato pancakes, fried in oil, made with whatever was left, and eaten in silence, except for the crunch. One bite and the past came rushing back, hot, crispy, and deeply familiar. Baked apples with honey were such an incredible medieval dish that they were especially for any kind of party or celebration. The baking was always done near the fire or a hearth oven, and the dish was incredibly simple. It really was just an apple that was baked whole with honey drizzled over it, or sometimes they would simply dip the whole thing in honey. People would also boil the apples first and then bake them to get a dish that resembled the texture of apple pudding as we know it today. This dish was eaten at the end of a course or as a fast day meal, and honey and apples were things that you could eat on days where you had to fast. The combination of a softened, decadent apple mixed in with caramelized golden honey was something that scratched all the right itches. Baked apples with honey had an incredibly strong association with festive and seasonal meals, and they were particularly really popular around harvest and Christmas. Apples were abundant, and honey was something that people could spare sometimes for the right kind of occasion. This dish is something you see in medical texts, estate records, cookbooks, and other medieval-era references. Apples were also prized because of how easy they were to store. Boiled onion dinners are essentially exactly what they sound like. The idea here was to take an entire onion, use some salt and pepper, and, well, just get to it. This isn't really something that I think could apply at all today to our world or lifestyle anymore, but if you feel differently or better yet, have different experiences surrounding this, please mention them in the comments. I'm so curious about what this even feels like afterward. This is very telling of the kind of lifestyles people were having before the Depression ended. It was something that was really common in early American frontier households, especially the ones from the 18th and 19th centuries. Onions back then used to be equivalent to treasure because of how well they were stored, and they also were seen as a wonderful flavoring ingredient. Then, in Appalachia and different parts of the South, onions were such a common crop that they became a regular at dinners. It became standard practice to boil whole onions and have them together with some cornbread, of course. Any meat would help, but it was rarely given. Interestingly enough, from what I've read, the onion is supposed to get sweeter. But that's also a little strange because you just don't associate onions with that kind of flavor, right? There was a time when meatloaf was a household tradition. Made from simple, inexpensive ingredients, it was a staple of weeknight dinners and homecoming feasts alike. But what made this version special was the glaze, a perfectly balanced mix of ketchup and brown sugar that caramelized into a sticky, flavorful coating as it baked. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins, and by mixing it with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, home cooks could stretch a single pound to feed an entire family. Some variations included oats or crushed crackers, while others relied on Worcestershire sauce and mustard for added depth. But the secret weapon was always the glaze, a blend of sweet and tangy flavors that sealed in moisture and gave the loaf its signature glossy finish. So why did this dish start disappearing from dinner tables? As dietary trends shifted, meatloaf's reputation took a hit. Low-carb diets, leaner meat choices, and a move away from home-cooked comfort foods made it less popular. Pre-made frozen meatloaves also contributed, offering convenience at the cost of homemade flavor. Ostra was born out of the 1960s drive to reinvent everyday food. This fat substitute promised guilt-free indulgence without the extra calories. Its introduction coincided with a time when scientific optimism often outpaced regulatory oversight. As the industry celebrated a marvel of chemical engineering, food safety protocols were only just beginning to catch up, leaving a gap that allowed unanticipated health concerns to emerge. Consumers embraced Ostra for its novelty and promise of a lighter future, even as emerging reports hinted at severe gastrointestinal distress. Laboratory findings eventually revealed that, while free of traditional fat calories, this compound could disrupt the absorption of essential vitamins and cause digestive discomfort. This paradox, a product engineered to aid dietary goals that ultimately compromised nutritional well-being, became a cautionary tale in modern food history. Interestingly, advertisements once lauded Ostra as the solution for those seeking to enjoy their favorite snacks without compromise. However, As adverse effects accumulated, both scientists and regulators pushed for tighter safety measures, marking a significant turning point in food additive scrutiny. Turkey divan was how leftovers became legend. You started with dry bits of Sunday's bird, some broccoli from the freezer, and a can of cream of chicken soup. Then came the magic, a cheese sauce, sometimes called mornay if you wanted to sound fancy, poured over everything and baked until bubbly. It came out golden, rich, and smelling like someone tried. That mattered. It was a casserole that masked fatigue, dressed up scraps, and made Tuesday dinner feel like Thanksgiving's secret encore. Dads liked it. Moms knew it was efficient. Kids just remembered the gooey forkfuls and how broccoli did not taste like punishment when it was drowning in cheese. In the 1980s, dishes like this were culinary glue, binding time, taste, and tradition. Turkey divan did not make headlines, but it made memories. The kind you recall when you open a fridge of leftovers and wish you could call your mother to ask how she made it taste so good. It was never just about cleaning out the fridge. It was about warming the room, feeding the family, and reminding everyone that even the scraps had value. Baked turnips with herbs is an example of how even a simple and humble root vegetable can be turned into something that gets your kids at the table if you know what you're doing. Luckily, medieval-era cooks had a lot of room for trial and error, and they definitely learned a few things about working with turnips. While baking them was never as common as stewing or boiling them, it was extremely good. Households that had the privilege of a bake oven would abuse that luxury maliciously, in fact. That's just how nice it was. In households where that wasn't a thing, turnips were typically wrapped in kale or cabbage leaves and then baked in ashes or at the edges of a hearth. This was a pretty rustic method, but it would help to soften the turnip, and it let the herbs introduce some much-needed flavor. Of course, you had to be very careful that what you were doing wasn't going to burn the turnips. Monasteries were most commonly known for preparing turnips, and they relied pretty much entirely on olive oil and butter. This resulting dish was something that was really earthy and savory, but the herbs helped when it came to the taste of turnips. For some, that taste can be really overwhelming. Corn dodgers weren't always the Super Bowl phenomena you know them to be today. Back in the day, they were actually one of the few ways where families could eat and still be full. Corn dodgers basically involve corn cakes that are either fried or baked and then served as a main dish. But when people had any kind of meat or potatoes, just anything at all that was bulkier and heavier to serve it with, they would almost always serve it as a side dish. Still, corn dodgers were essential to getting by the day back then, and they're just as important now. Making these at home is as easy as it gets as well, because once you have the mixture for a corn cake ready, which is a really simple process involving like 3 steps max, all you need to do is shape them into form and get to frying. These make for such a cheap and affordable midday snack, and they're the perfect thing to come back to from work. Best part? You can prepare meals and make enough corn cake batter and just freeze it, so you don't even have to deal with the entire process when you get back home tired from work. For decades, this dish was the definition of hearty, home-cooked comfort food. A cross between a hamburger and a meatloaf, Salisbury steak offered all the savory satisfaction of a beefy main course, without the expense of premium cuts. Smothered in a rich mushroom and onion gravy, it was often served alongside mashed potatoes, soaking up every last drop of its flavorful sauce. The origins of this dish date back to the late 19th century when Dr. James Salisbury, a physician, promoted chopped beef as a health food. But it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it became a household favorite, especially during the post-war years when ground beef was an affordable, versatile staple. Mixing the meat with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings helped stretch a family's grocery budget, making it a go-to recipe for filling, cost-effective meals. The cooking process was simple yet rewarding. The beef patties were seared to lock in flavor, then simmered slowly in a rich, savory gravy made from beef broth, onions, and mushrooms. The rise of frozen TV dinners turned Salisbury steak into a mass-produced meal, often losing the homemade taste that made it special. Of all the risky delicacies in food history, few come with stakes as high as canned puffer fish. Revered for its delicate taste, yet feared for its lethal potential, this fish contains tetrodotoxin. a neurotoxin so potent that a dose smaller than a pinhead can cause paralysis and death. Today, only highly trained chefs are allowed to prepare it, but in the past, access was far less controlled. In unregulated markets, improperly prepared fugu was available in cans, turning a simple meal into a gamble with survival. The appeal of fugu wasn't just about flavor, it was about thrill. For some, eating it was a status symbol, a culinary daredevil act that proved one's bravery. But unlike most food-related risks, this one didn't end with an upset stomach. There's no antidote for tetrodotoxin, meaning a mistake in preparation could be fatal. Yet, regulations in the 1960s weren't nearly as strict as they are today, and canned versions were sold in some markets without the careful oversight now required. As reports of poisoning surfaced, authorities clamped down. Many countries banned unregulated sales, limiting its preparation to certified chefs. Cream-chipped ham over toast was the sort of meal you could smell from the driveway, and not always in a good way. You started with thin-sliced lunch meat, chipped into ribbons, usually from the deli's cheapest bin. Tossed it into a bubbling white gravy made from flour, margarine, and milk. Stirred until it thickened like pudding. Then ladled the whole mess over white toast or biscuits. The salty ham melted into the sauce. The bread went soggy fast. And somehow, it all worked. In factory towns and Pennsylvania kitchens, this was a staple. They even gave it names like SOS, stuff on a shingle, though the S didn't always stand for stuff. It was a working man's breakfast, a quick lunch, or a thrown-together dinner when time and money both ran out. The kids didn't ask for seconds, but they didn't go to bed hungry either. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even really appetizing, but it was food that stuck with you, literally and figuratively. And on cold nights, with the news humming in the background and the toast steaming on a chipped plate, it reminded you that even a mess of gravy and scraps could feel like a warm hug. Onion tarts were naturally one of the go-to meals for people, given how important onions themselves were in times like these. But one has to ask, what really is an onion tart? A typical medieval tart would basically start with a coarse flour crust. This would be made from the typical rye, barley, and maslin mixes we've seen so far, and that's how the pastry was made. This would be a vessel for the filling, which would be made out of parboiled onions and butter. These softened onions would be mixed with herbs and then enriched more with eggs or fresh cheese, whichever was available, or both, if you were doing well. This mixture would then go into the shell of the tart, and it would then be baked until you would get a lightly browned surface. In southern Europe and the regions that are now France and Germany, this dish was the predecessor of dishes like onion pies in modern times. This was a pretty herbal-tasting dish that carried the flavor of onions over almost perfectly, and it was something people would rely on when they wanted an open-faced, savory treat. Once a staple of working-class kitchens, this hearty one-dish meal was built on the kind of ingredients that stretched a family's budget without sacrificing flavor. Cabbage, potatoes, and smoked sausage, three of the most economical and widely available foods, came together in layers, baked slowly in a rich mustard cream sauce. The result was a rustic, deeply satisfying dish that filled bellies and kept families warm through colder months. Cabbage was a practical ingredient, valued for its long shelf life and versatility. When paired with smoky seasoned sausage and starchy potatoes, it created a meal that was both inexpensive and packed with flavor. The mustard-infused cream sauce added a tangy richness, tying everything together. Some home cooks added a dash of vinegar for brightness, while others incorporated cheese for extra indulgence. No matter the variation, this dish was proof that humble ingredients could create something truly special. Why did it fall out of favor? The rise of prepackaged meals and low-carb trends made cabbage-heavy dishes less common, and as quick stovetop meals replaced slow-baked casseroles, this once popular dish faded from view. Seafood has long been praised as a healthy, protein-rich option, but in the 1960s, some portions came with an unexpected side effect: mercury exposure. As industrial pollution increased, heavy metals made their way into oceans and rivers, accumulating in fish that millions consumed daily. At the time, awareness of mercury's dangers was limited, and food regulations had yet to impose strict monitoring. Consumers enjoyed their seafood dinners unaware that certain species carried levels of the toxic element high enough to pose serious health risks. Mercury is particularly insidious because it builds up in the body over time. While a single meal wouldn't cause immediate harm, consistent exposure could lead to neurological damage, developmental issues in children, and even kidney failure. Pregnant women were at the highest risk, as mercury could interfere with fetal brain development. Yet, in the mid-century push for convenience and affordability, few questioned what lurked beneath the surface of their favorite fish dishes. It wasn't until the 1970s, after growing scientific research and public outcry, that regulatory agencies like the FDA established strict mercury limits in seafood. Hamburger Cornbake was one of those dinners that made the whole house smell like something good was happening, even when nothing else was. You browned a pound of ground beef in a pan, stirred in a can of creamed corn, maybe some onion, and poured the whole thing into a baking dish. Then you mixed up some cornbread batter, jiffy, if you were smart and short on time, and poured it over the top. Baked it until the cornbread puffed up golden and cracked just a little at the edges. It came out hot, steamy, and smelling like Sunday dinner on a Tuesday. The sweetness of the corn played against the savory beef, and that soft layer of cornbread on top soaked it all in like a sponge. You didn't need sides, you didn't need seconds, but you took them anyway. It was the kind of meal that shut kids up and made adults sit down. It was filling without being fussy, warm without being heavy. It made you forget for a minute that everything in it came from a can, a box, or a pound wrapped in plastic. Because on that plate, it all came together like comfort should. Garlic and leek broth was something that small-town dwellers would eat a lot. They were both reliable crops, and if that wasn't possible, they were both quite affordable. They were essential plants in almost every kitchen in most European countries. This broth in particular was valued in most communities because of its restorative properties. You ever had a broth or a soup that really just makes you feel 10 years younger again? Yeah, it was that kind of thing. Broth itself was really simple. Leeks could be sliced and cleaned, and then they would be crushed. And both of these would simmer in water, a light vegetable stock, and the broth could pretty much be flavored with salt. It could also be packed into pots and taken as a portable dish. Fresh or dried herbs like parsley, marjoram, and thyme were wonderful little additions to this dish. This isn't a dish that's unique to Europe either. It's a recipe that's seen in Chinese medieval cookbooks, Byzantine recipes, and many traditional recipes from Islamic countries. Cabbage and corned beef hash have a really practical history in American food culture. It's something that came about as a humble wartime dish whose purpose was to turn any leftovers into something that could really get people seated at the table, but it also just shows you how resourceful people were. Corned beef hash was pretty recent considering it made its name during World War I and World War II, right when it was introduced into the United States. The canned version, like the Hormel's cans you've probably seen lining up grocery store marts, is actually something that was the lifeblood of many people back then. Corned beef hash was an insane step forward because it meant that rationed, affordable, preserved meat was now more accessible than ever. And that only meant that things like cabbage, which were year-round vegetables, were that much more in demand as side items, ingredients, and toppings. Corned beef hash was a way for people to have cheap calories and protein, and it makes sense too, because the thing was designed for maximum efficiency, so it could be used by soldiers during wartime. Slow cooking was once a necessity, not a luxury. Before pressure cookers and pre-packaged meals, tougher cuts of beef were transformed through hours of gentle simmering, unlocking deep, rich flavors. This smoky Chipotle beef ragu was one such dish, a meal that took time but rewarded patience with melt-in-your-mouth tenderness. Chipotle peppers, known for their earthy heat, were a staple in traditional Mexican and Southwestern cooking, but by the mid-20th century, their smoky kick found its way into American kitchens. Paired with tomatoes, garlic, and slow-braised beef, this dish delivered a bold, layered flavor that stood apart from ordinary pot roasts. Served over creamy polenta or even buttered noodles, it was both comforting and deeply satisfying. Despite its rich taste, this meal was surprisingly budget-friendly. Beef chuck or brisket, once some of the most affordable cuts, became tender and flavorful when cooked low and slow. The sauce was built from pantry staples, making it an easy, accessible choice for home cooks. But over time, as quick weeknight meals took priority and polenta lost ground to pasta and rice, this dish faded from dinner tables. Today, Chipotle has seen a resurgence in trendy restaurants, but this home-style beef ragu remains a forgotten classic. Processed meats have long been a fixture of the American diet, offering convenience, affordability, and a satisfying smoky flavor. But there was one key ingredient that made these meats last longer and look more appetizing: sodium nitrate. In the 1960s, it was used liberally in everything from bacon to hot dogs, ensuring bright red hues and extended shelf life. Few questioned what made their deli meat so vibrant, but as science advanced, concerns began to emerge. At the time, food preservation was a priority, and sodium nitrate was seen as a practical solution. It prevented bacterial growth and gave processed meats a signature cured taste. However, researchers later discovered a darker side. When exposed to high heat, sodium nitrate could form nitrosamines, compounds linked to cancer in animal studies. While a single ham sandwich wasn't a cause for alarm, a lifetime of consuming highly processed meats raised significant health concerns. By the 1970s, regulatory agencies stepped in, limiting nitrate levels and requiring careful monitoring. While still legal today in controlled amounts, many consumers now seek nitrate-free options. The story of sodium nitrate serves as a reminder that food science is constantly evolving. Cheesy broccoli rice casserole made vegetables feel like an indulgence. In an era where frozen veggies were the norm and kids turned their noses up at anything green, this dish was a miracle. Cooked white rice, thawed broccoli, a can of cream soup, and a heavy chunk of Velveeta, all stirred together and baked into a golden, bubbling casserole. It was thick, creamy, and just salty enough to satisfy a tired adult and trick a picky child. It smelled like warmth, it looked like effort, and it tasted like someone still cared. The kind of food that stayed hot even after you came back for seconds. It was never elegant, but it was loved. The dish could stretch to feed 5 or just 2 with leftovers for the lunchbox. No one bragged about it, but everyone cleaned their plates. In houses where money was counted and casseroles were king, this cheesy, starchy wonder was the great equalizer. Even dads who hated broccoli grew to respect this one. Almond milk porridge was a very common dish throughout the medieval times. It was something 2 groups of people would use very regularly. One, it's something you would always see in a wealthy person's pantry. Almond milk was seen as a luxurious kind of milk, and the cost of almonds was high. Second, it was common amongst Catholic citizens who were fasting on Fridays. Animal-related products would often be banned during fasts, but almond milk was just plant-based. It was a lot more typical to see it in monastic kitchens and in cities rather than anywhere outside of that. The porridge would be made by simmering the grains until they were soft and thick, and then almond milk would be added in and stirred so that the dish could become smoother and more rich. People back then would grind blanched almonds into pastes and then steep them in water. They'd strain the mixture through a cloth to produce the liquid, and the leftover pulp was something people would use in cakes and other desserts or for more porridge later on. It was a pretty comforting and refreshing dish. Johnny cakes are an incredibly economical meal and also one with extreme amounts of history. They're something that have really deep roots in Native American cooking and also a very long record of being appropriated by settlers, but one way or the other, they managed to spread all over America. Let's cut to the chase. Johnny cakes are actually just fried cornmeal cakes, but they're flat and made on a pan fry. The difference between these and normal pancakes is that these ones actually do not have any kind of eggs, wheat, or leavening to them. And to be honest, that happens a fair amount of times. You may even have enough money to get those things, but you may just not have the energy to do groceries right now. And on days like that, who says you can't indulge in some corny history? You don't even need any kind of tools or ovens for this. All you need is a skillet or an iron griddle. Don't have baking powder? Not a problem. No yeast? Don't even worry about it. Johnny cakes have a massive history of being used in this way by everyone in the country, stretching first from the Narragansett people of Rhode Island to you and I today. That's some history, isn't it? Few side dishes could bridge the gap between savory and sweet as effortlessly as corn pudding. A staple of Southern and Midwestern homecoming dinners, this dish combined farm-fresh simplicity with a rich, custard-like texture. Families often served it alongside roasted meats or holiday spreads, where its golden hue and delicate sweetness made it a comforting favorite. Whether fresh off the cob in the summer or canned in colder months, it was inexpensive and widely available. This recipe used basic pantry staples, butter, milk, eggs, and a touch of sugar to create a dish that felt indulgent despite its humble ingredients. Baking was the preferred method, allowing the custard to set while keeping the kernels tender. Some families swore by a cast-iron skillet, while others used deep casserole dishes to achieve that perfect golden crust. Recipes varied. Some included a splash of vanilla, others added a pinch of nutmeg. But the result was always a creamy, spoonable side that paired with almost anything. As processed cornbread mixes and quick-fix alternatives took over, traditional corn pudding was left behind. But for those who remember its warm, velvety bite, it's a dish worth bringing back. If these 80s dinners stirred a memory, leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe so we don't forget what got us through.